The conception date puts us at about 8 weeks, Mary Richardson was saying, her voice carrying that same gentle strength that had captivated him from the moment they'd met. Right around the time the divorce was finalized. 8 weeks. The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. 8 weeks ago, on their last night together, when he'd held her like he was drowning and she was the only thing keeping him afloat. When they'd made love with a desperate passion that tasted like goodbye and felt like his heart being ripped from his chest. Damon's hands began to shake, the same hands that had built a billion-dollar empire without a tremor now betraying him completely. He'd come to this medical building for a consultation about the stress-induced migraines that had been splitting his skull open since Mary walked out of his life. He'd chosen this particular building because it was 3 blocks from her apartment, harboring some pathetic hope of catching a glimpse of her on the street. He never imagined he'd discover she was carrying his child. "Have you contacted the father?" Dr. Harriet's warm voice carried the weight of professional concern. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Damon found himself holding his breath, every nerve in his body screaming as he waited for her answer. "He doesn't know," Mary said finally, her voice quieter now but resolute. "And I don't plan to tell him." The world tilted violently. Damon gripped the wall so hard his knuckles went white, his perfectly controlled facade cracking like ice under pressure. She wasn't going to tell him. The woman who'd once promised to love him forever was planning to raise their child, without him ever knowing they existed. "Mary," Dr. Harriet said gently, "every child deserves to know their father. And perhaps he deserves the chance to, not this father." The pain in Mary's voice was like a blade between his ribs. He made his choice when he signed those divorce papers. He chose his boardroom over our bedroom, his meetings over our marriage, his empire over everything that actually mattered. "I won't give my baby false hope about a father who sees family as an obligation rather than a gift." Each word was a condemnation, accurate and devastating. Damon closed his eyes, remembering the moment 4 weeks ago when he'd sat in that conference room with their attorneys, watching Mary's lawyer slide the divorce papers across the mahogany table. Miranda Kane had looked at him with barely concealed disgust as she'd listed his failures like evidence in a criminal trial. Chronic emotional unavailability, she'd read from her notes. Consistent prioritization of professional obligations over marital commitments. Inability to maintain basic communication during extended business trips. Missed anniversaries, canceled dates, and a pattern of choosing work over his wife's needs. He'd wanted to fight it. God, how he'd wanted to tear those papers into confetti and beg Mary to give him another chance. But the look in her eyes, that devastating combination of exhaustion and resignation, had told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't angry anymore. She was done. The exhaustion of fighting for a man who'd never learned how to fight for her had finally broken her spirit. His signature on those documents had felt like signing his own death warrant. Each letter of his name had been carved into the paper with hands that shook with suppressed grief. Mary had sat across from him in that navy dress he'd bought her for their 2nd anniversary, the one that made her eyes look like warm honey, and hadn't looked at him once during the entire proceeding. She'd signed away their 3 years of marriage with steady hands and dry eyes, as if she'd already grieved their relationship to death months ago. But this changed everything. "I have a good support system," Mary was saying now, her voice stronger, more determined. "My brother Michael has been incredible, and I'm finally building my consulting business into something sustainable. This baby and I will be just fine without him." The certainty in her voice was devastating. She'd already imagined a future without him, already made peace with raising his child alone. Their son or daughter would grow up never knowing their father's voice, never feeling his protective embrace, never learning that they were wanted desperately, completely wanted. "Very well," Dr. Harriet said with professional acceptance tinged by personal regret. "I'll schedule your next appointment for 2 weeks from today. But Mary, if you change your mind about contacting the father." "I won't change my mind." The finality in those words echoed through the hallway like a funeral bell. Damon heard the soft rustling of papers, the scrape of a chair against linoleum. She was leaving. In moments, she would walk through that door and see him standing there like a broken statue in his $3,000 suit, and then what? What could he possibly say that would undo months of damage, years of choosing everything except the woman who'd given him her whole heart? But as her footsteps approached the door, rational thought fled entirely. This was Mary, his Mary, carrying their child, and she was planning to disappear from his life forever. The same desperate panic that had gripped him the night she'd packed her bags seized him now, magnified tenfold by the knowledge of what he stood to lose. The door opened, and time stopped. Every sound in the bustling medical building faded to nothing. His thundering heartbeat quieted to a whisper. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim as he drank in the sight of her. Mary had always been breathtaking, the kind of beautiful that made grown men forget their own names, but pregnancy had wrapped her in an ethereal glow that made his chest ache with longing. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the harsh hallway lighting and transforming it into something magical. Her warm brown eyes were bright with health and purpose, and her skin seemed to radiate light from within. But it was the gentle curve of her belly beneath her flowing emerald dress that brought him to his knees. Their child. Growing inside the woman he'd loved since the moment he'd first seen her at that gallery opening 3 years ago, when she'd been explaining the emotional symbolism in an abstract painting to an elderly couple with such passion and grace that he'd found himself eavesdropping just to hear her voice. Damon. His name fell from her lips like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to echo through the sterile hallway. Her face cycled through emotions so quickly he could barely track them: surprise, confusion, a flash of something that might have been joy, then anger, and finally the carefully constructed mask of polite indifference that he'd learned to dread during the final months of their marriage. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd stopped fighting for his attention and started protecting her heart instead. The look that said she'd built walls so high and thick that not even he could scale them anymore. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was steady, controlled, but he caught the slight tremor beneath the surface that told him she wasn't as unaffected as she wanted to appear. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly in a protective gesture that awakened something primal and fierce in his chest. Every dominant, possessive instinct he'd spent years learning to control in the boardroom came roaring to life as he watched her shield their unborn child from him. From him. As if he were a threat rather than the father who would move mountains to protect them both. "I was." The words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. How could he explain that he'd been coming to this medical building for weeks, hoping for a glimpse of her? How could he tell her that he'd chosen this doctor specifically because it was close to her apartment, that he'd been driving past her building every morning on his way to work like some pathetic stalker? How could he admit that he'd been slowly dying without her, that every breath felt like drowning, that success and money and power meant absolutely nothing when he had no one to share them with? "You look." He swallowed hard, his gray eyes devouring every detail of her face like a man seeing water after months in the desert. "You look radiant." Something flickered in her expression, a crack in that carefully maintained composure. For just a heartbeat, he saw the woman who used to melt into his arms, who used to whisper his name like a prayer in the darkness of their bedroom, who used to look at him like he hung the moon and stars just for her. Then the mask slammed back into place with almost audible force. "I have to go." She moved to step around him, but the hallway was narrow, and as she passed, her shoulder brushed against his chest. The contact was barely there, whisper of touch through fabric, but it sent electricity shooting through his entire nervous system like he'd been struck by lightning. Every nerve ending came alive, every cell in his body remembering what it felt like to hold her, to touch her, to be the man she chose above all others. She felt it too. He saw it in the way her breath caught, in the slight widening of her eyes, in the way her step faltered for just a fraction of a second before she forced herself to keep walking. 3 years of marriage hadn't dimmed the fire between them. If anything, 4 weeks of separation had only made it burn hotter. "Mary, wait." His hand moved without conscious thought, reaching for her arm, but she was already walking away from him with determined precision, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown to his execution. He stood there watching her go, this woman who'd once been his entire world, now carrying the most precious secret in the universe. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Damon was left alone with the antiseptic smell and the fluorescent humming and the devastating knowledge that he was going to be a father. A father whose child would never know his name. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. What would you do if you discovered the love of your life was carrying your child just weeks after you'd lost them forever? How do you fight for a future when you've already proven you're not worthy of the fight? These were the questions burning through Damon's mind 6 hours later as he stood in his corner office 40 floors above the city, staring out at the glittering lights that had once represented everything he'd thought he wanted. The penthouse view that had cost him 8 figures now felt like a prison cell, cold and empty and echoing with the ghost of her laughter. 6 hours since he'd seen Mary in that hallway. 6 hours of pacing his office like a caged predator, ignoring the concerned looks from his assistant Elena, canceling meeting after meeting while his mind spun in desperate, chaotic circles. She was pregnant. With his child. And she had no intention of telling him. The rational part of his brain, the part that had built a tech empire from nothing, understood her reasoning with painful clarity. He'd been a terrible husband. Absent when she needed him most, emotionally unavailable when she'd begged for connection, so consumed with proving his worth through professional success that he'd forgotten to nurture the most valuable thing in his life. But the primitive, possessive part of him, the part that had claimed her as his from that first night together, was roaring with the need to protect, to provide, to wrap her and their unborn child in his arms and never let the world touch them again. His phone buzzed insistently with another urgent email, another crisis that apparently required his immediate attention. The Singapore investors were still waiting for his call. The merger with Chen Industries hung in the balance. 3 board meetings had been postponed because he couldn't focus on anything except the image of Mary's hand protectively covering their child. 3 years ago, he would have been back at his desk in seconds, fingers flying over the keyboard as he solved problems and made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. Work had been his drug, his validation, his proof that he was worthy of existence. Tonight, he couldn't have cared less if the entire empire burned to ash around him. A soft knock interrupted his torment. Elena Vasquez peered around the door, her dark eyes filled with the same concern she'd shown for the past 4 weeks as she'd watched him slowly deteriorate. Mr. Cross? The Singapore investors are still holding on line 3, and your father called again about the emergency board meeting tomorrow. Damon turned from the window, and Elena took an involuntary step backward at whatever she saw in his face. Elena had worked for him for 5 years, had seen him through the highest highs and lowest lows of building his company, but she'd never seen him look quite so shattered. Like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump or fight his way back to solid ground. "Cancel Singapore," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. "Cancel everything." "Sir?" Elena's professional composure wavered. In 5 years, Damon Cross had never cancelled a meeting with investors. Never postponed a board emergency. Never put anything above the relentless pursuit of business excellence. "I need you to do something for me, Elena." He moved to his desk, pulling out a business card with hands that still trembled slightly. "I need you to find out everything you can about Mary Richardson's schedule. Where she goes, when she goes there, what time she takes her morning walks. I need to know how to accidentally run into her." Elena's eyes widened with understanding and hope. She'd adored Mary during the marriage, had often commented that Mrs. Cross brought light and warmth into the sterile corporate environment. When the divorce had been finalized, Elena had cried in the supply closet for 20 minutes. Is she? Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the desperate hope underneath. Are you going to try to win her back? Damon looked down at his hands that had signed away the best thing in his life 4 weeks ago because he'd been too proud and too scared to fight for what mattered most. I'm going to try to become the man she deserved from the beginning, he said quietly. The man our child deserves. Elena's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen in his office since Mary had stopped visiting. Our child, sir. She's pregnant, Elena. 16 weeks, maybe more. And she's planning to raise my baby alone because I destroyed her faith in me so completely that she'd rather be a single mother than give me another chance to disappoint her. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Oh, Mr. Cross. Oh, that's wonderful. That's terrifying, Damon finished for her. Because I have no idea how to be the father a child deserves. I have no idea how to convince the woman I love that I've changed when I spent 3 years proving I couldn't. You'll figure it out, Elena said with fierce conviction. And sir? It's about time you put your family first. Mrs. Cross, Mary, she's been waiting for you to choose her for 3 years. Maybe this baby is exactly the wake-up call you needed. As Elena left to begin her research, Damon sank into his leather chair and closed his eyes. Somewhere across the city, Mary was probably having dinner in her small apartment, maybe talking to their child, telling their baby about her day. The thought of her cradling that gentle swell of her belly, of her voice soft and loving as she whispered to the life growing inside her, made his chest constrict with such longing he could barely breathe. He'd missed so much already. The moment she'd discovered she was pregnant, the first time she'd felt the baby move, the first time she'd heard their child's heartbeat. All of those precious milestones had happened without him, and it was his own damn fault. But he wasn't going to miss any more. He couldn't. Mary Richardson stood 20 blocks away in her cozy apartment kitchen, stirring honey into a cup of chamomile tea while her free hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly. Dar. Harriet had said the baby was developing perfectly, right on schedule for an early spring arrival. Everything was exactly as it should be. So why did she feel like her carefully constructed world had just been hit by an earthquake? Seeing Damon in that hallway had been like being struck by lightning and drowning in ice water simultaneously. For one devastating moment, all the anger and hurt and protective walls she'd built over the past 4 weeks had crumbled to dust, leaving her exposed and vulnerable and aching with the memory of what they'd once had. He'd looked as shocked as she'd felt, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his gray eyes wide with something that looked almost like panic. And when his gaze had dropped to her belly, the expression on his face had been so raw, so filled with longing and wonder and desperate hunger, that she'd had to grip the doorframe to keep her knees from buckling. But she couldn't let herself be fooled by one moment of apparent vulnerability. This was the same man who'd missed their second anniversary because of a conference call with Tokyo. The same man who'd promised to be home for dinner dozens of times, only to text at the last minute that something urgent had come up. The same man who'd made love to her with desperate passion and then checked his phone while she was still breathless in his arms, her heart racing and her body humming with satisfaction. She moved to her small balcony, settling into the cushioned chair that overlooked the city. The evening air was warm against her skin, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the small garden she'd started on the fire escape. This little sanctuary had become her refuge over the past month, the place where she came to think and plan and dream about the future she was building for herself and her baby. A future that, until today, had felt secure and certain. She sipped her tea and tried to push thoughts of Damon from her mind, but it was impossible. The way he'd looked at her belly with such wonder, such obvious longing, had shaken something loose inside her chest. For just a moment, she'd remembered the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd traced patterns on her skin in the darkness and whispered about the children they'd have someday, the family they'd build together. But that man had disappeared somewhere between their wedding day and their divorce papers, buried beneath boardroom meetings and acquisition deals and the relentless pursuit of more, always more. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. How did the appointment go? Is my future niece or nephew behaving themselves? Mary smiled despite her emotional turmoil. Michael had been her anchor through the divorce, offering his spare bedroom when she'd needed a place to stay, helping her move into this apartment, never once saying, "I told you so," even though he'd warned her about Damon's workaholic tendencies from the very beginning. She started to type back about the appointment, then hesitated. She wasn't ready to tell anyone about seeing Damon. Wasn't ready to analyze what it meant or what she was going to do about the way her heart had nearly exploded out of her chest when she'd seen him standing there. Instead, she texted, "All good. Baby is perfect and healthy. Love you." His response was immediate, "Love you too, sis. Call if you need anything. Maria is making tamales tomorrow if you want to come over." Mary set the phone aside and leaned back in her chair, one hand moving to her belly in the unconscious gesture that had become second nature. At 16 weeks, the baby was barely showing to most people, just a gentle roundness that could be hidden beneath flowing clothes. But to her, it felt like the most obvious thing in the world, this precious life growing inside her. "What am I going to do, little one?" she whispered to the night air. "Your daddy, he's not a bad man. He's just complicated. And I'm scared that if I let him back into our lives, he'll break both our hearts." The baby couldn't answer, of course, but she imagined she felt a flutter of movement, as if their child was already trying to navigate the complex waters of having Damon cross as a father. Mary closed her eyes and let herself remember, just for a moment, the night their baby had been conceived. It was the night before their divorce was finalized, and they'd both been raw with grief and desperation. He'd come to the apartment, their apartment then, to collect some of his things, and she'd been sitting on this same balcony, crying silent tears for the death of their marriage. He'd found her there, and for the first time in months, he'd really looked at her. Not the distracted glance of a man with his mind on the next deal, but the focused, intense attention that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered, and the words had been so raw, so broken, that she'd started crying all over again. "I know," she'd whispered back, because she did know. She knew he was sorry, knew he'd never meant to hurt her, knew that his inability to prioritize their marriage had been about his own wounds and fears rather than a lack of love. But knowing hadn't been enough to save them. They'd held each other that night, made love with a desperate tenderness that spoke of goodbye and tasted like tears. He'd worshipped her body like it was a temple he was about to lose access to forever, and she'd given herself to him completely one last time, knowing it would have to last her a lifetime. Then he'd left before dawn, taking the last pieces of her heart with him. 6 weeks later, she'd stared at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test and felt her world shift on its axis. Now, as she sat in the gathering darkness, Mary felt that familiar ache of longing mixed with the steel of hard-won self-protection. She'd spent 4 weeks learning how to live without him, how to build a life that didn't revolve around his schedule and his needs and his complicated relationship with love. She wasn't going to give that up. Not even for those storm-gray eyes that had always seen straight through to her soul. Share with me in the comments, have you ever had a moment that changed everything in an instant? I love hearing how your stories connect with ours. Chapter 2. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and settles there like unresolved grief. Mary had barely slept, her dreams haunted by storm-gray eyes and the memory of Damon's stricken face when he'd seen her pregnant form. She'd woken feeling emotionally fragile and physically drained, her usual morning routine disrupted by the chaos he'd reintroduced into her carefully ordered world. She'd just finished forcing down her breakfast of whole grain toast and ginger tea, the only things that didn't trigger her morning nausea, when her doorbell rang with unexpected urgency. Through the peephole, she saw Elena Vasquez standing in the hallway, clutching a massive bouquet of white lilies and looking uncharacteristically nervous. Mary's heart clenched with a mixture of affection and apprehension. Elena had been more than just Damon's assistant during their marriage. She'd been a friend, a confidant, someone who'd made the sterile corporate world feel warmer and more human. But Mary hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, afraid that maintaining any connection to Damon's world would make it harder to heal and move forward. She opened the door slowly, drinking in the sight of the woman who'd once been like a sister to her. Elena. Mrs. Mary. Elena caught herself mid-title, and Mary felt a sharp pang at the correction. 3 years of being Mrs. Cross, and now she was just Mary again, untethered, undefined, starting over. I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced. I know things are complicated between you and Mr. Cross, but I needed to see you. Elena's dark eyes were bright with unshed tears, and despite everything, despite the divorce, despite the walls she'd built, despite her determination to move forward without looking back, Mary felt her heart soften immediately. Come in, she said, stepping aside to let Elena enter. You look like you could use some coffee. I brought these for you. Elena held out the lilies with trembling hands. I remember they were always your favorites. You used to keep them on your desk at the office, and you said they reminded you of new beginnings. Mary accepted the flowers, breathing in their sweet, intoxicating fragrance. The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly Elena, that she felt tears prick at her eyes. They're beautiful. Thank you. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them like a physical presence. The friendship they'd shared felt simultaneously distant and immediate, changed by circumstances but not destroyed by them. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He's different, Mary. Since the divorce. He's broken in a way I've never seen before. Mary turned away, busying herself with arranging the lilies in a crystal vase while she tried to process this information without letting it affect her too deeply. She couldn't let herself care about Damon's pain, not when she was still healing from her own. Elena. She said carefully, not turning around. I'm not trying to interfere, Elena said quickly, moving closer to the kitchen island. I know he hurt you. I know he made choices that destroyed your marriage, choices that left you feeling abandoned and unimportant. I watched it happen, and I hated myself for not speaking up, for not telling him he was being an idiot. Mary's hands stilled on the vase. In all the years Elena had worked for Damon, she'd never once criticized his decisions or questioned his priorities. She'd been the perfect assistant, loyal, discreet, professional to a fault. But Mary, Elena continued, her voice gaining strength, I've worked for him for 5 years. I've seen him through hostile takeovers and failed negotiations and board rebellions. I've never seen him like this. He's lost weight, barely sleeps, can't focus on anything for more than 5 minutes. Yesterday, he cancelled a meeting with Singapore investors he's been trying to land for 8 months, just to sit in his office and stare out the window. Mary turned then, surprise flickering across her features. The Damon she'd known would never have cancelled an important meeting. His work had always come first, always been his highest priority, the thing that defined his worth and validated his existence. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice carefully neutral even as her heart began to race. Because I think he's finally realized what he lost, Elena said softly, her eyes filled with desperate hope. And maybe it's not too late for both of you to find your way back to each other. Mary moved to the living room, settling onto her couch with deliberate composure while inside, her emotions churned like a storm at sea. It is too late, Elena. I'm not going back to being second priority in my own marriage. I'm not going back to waiting by the phone for him to remember I exist. What if you weren't second priority? Elena moved to perch on the edge of the chair across from her, leaning forward with intense focus. What if he's finally ready to put you first? What if losing you taught him something he couldn't learn any other way? Mary stared at her hands, fighting the dangerous flutter of hope that Elena's words awakened in her chest. I can't risk it, she whispered. I have someone else to think about now. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elena's gaze dropped to Mary's midsection, taking in the subtle changes that 4 months of pregnancy had wrought, the gentle rounding of her belly, the fuller curve of her breasts, the ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from her skin. Understanding dawned slowly across Elena's face, followed by wonder, joy, and then a complex mixture of emotions that Mary couldn't quite decipher. "Oh," Elena breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Mary. You're 16 weeks, Mary confirmed quietly, her own hand moving instinctively to rest on her belly. "He doesn't know, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she processed this revelation. Mary could practically see the wheels turning in her mind, the loyal assistant calculating implications and possibilities. "Your secret is safe with me," Elena said finally, her voice solemn with promise. "But Mary, he has a right to know. And maybe becoming a father is exactly what he needs to become the man you both deserve. Or maybe it's exactly the kind of pressure that will send him running back to his boardroom," Mary countered, voicing the fear that had been eating at her for weeks. "Maybe the responsibility will overwhelm him, and he'll choose work over family again because it's easier than facing his own limitations." "You don't really believe that," Elena said gently. "I've seen how he looks at children, Mary. I've watched him with his business partners' kids at company picnics. There's something in his eyes, longing, a tenderness that he tries to hide. He wants to be a father. He's just scared he doesn't know how." After Elena left, promising to keep Mary's secret but clearly hoping she'd reconsider her decision, Mary found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She'd planned to spend the day working on a proposal for a new client, a small gallery that wanted help curating a show of emerging artists, but the words blurred on her laptop screen every time she tried to focus. Instead, she found herself thinking about Elena's words, about the possibility that Damon had truly changed, about the man she'd fallen in love with who might still exist beneath the workaholic exterior he'd cultivated. Around noon, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something, intuition, hope, or maybe just the desperate need to hear his voice, made her answer. "Mary?" His voice was tentative, uncertain in a way that was completely unlike the confident businessman she'd married. There was a vulnerability in those 2 syllables that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Her breath caught in her throat. "How did you get this number?" "I called your old office at the Morrison Gallery," he admitted. "I told them it was an emergency." "Is it?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted the hint of concern in her voice. There was a pause, filled with the weight of everything they weren't saying. "I need to see you," he said finally. "Please, Mary. Give me 5 minutes to say what I should have said months ago." Mary closed her eyes, her free hand moving to rest on her belly where their child was growing, safe and protected from the complicated world of their parents' relationship. "Damon." 5 minutes, he repeated, and she could hear the desperation beneath his controlled tone. "The coffee shop on 5th and Main. The one where we had our first date." The irony wasn't lost on her. Café Luna had been their beginning, the place where he'd made her laugh until her sides ached, where he'd told her about his dreams and his fears and made her believe in the possibility of forever. 1 hour, she said before her rational mind could overrule her heart. And Damon? It really is just 5 minutes. Café Luna was exactly as she remembered it, warm and intimate, with mismatched vintage furniture and the rich aroma of fresh ground coffee beans. Mary arrived first, choosing a secluded table in the back corner where they could talk without being overheard or interrupted. Her hands shook slightly as she ordered her usual, now decaf latte, a concession to pregnancy that she hoped he wouldn't notice or question. He walked in at exactly 1 o'clock, his tall frame filling the doorway as his eyes searched the cozy space with laser focus. When his gaze found hers, the impact was immediate and devastating. Even across the room, she could feel the magnetic pull of him, the dangerous attraction that had drawn her to him from their very first meeting and never truly faded. He approached slowly, as if afraid she might bolt like a startled deer, and slid into the chair across from her with careful deliberation. Up close, she could see the changes Elena had mentioned, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the subtle weight loss that made his cheekbones more pronounced, the lines of strain around his mouth that hadn't been there during their marriage. He looked like a man who'd been at war with himself and lost. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to contain. Mary wrapped her hands around her mug, using the ceramic warmth to steady herself against the onslaught of memories and feelings his presence evoked. "You said 5 minutes. Right." He leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes intense and focused in a way that brought back vivid memories of their courtship, when he'd looked at her like she was the most fascinating woman in the world. "Mary, I know I don't deserve this chance. I know I destroyed our marriage with my selfishness and my complete inability to prioritize what actually mattered. But I need you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life." She felt her carefully constructed defenses waver, but she kept her expression neutral. "We've been through this before, Damon. We wanted different things." "No," he said with fierce conviction, shaking his head. "We wanted exactly the same things. I was just too scared and too proud to admit it. You wanted a husband who would choose you over everything else. You wanted a partner who would be present emotionally and physically. You wanted someone who would love you the way you deserve to be loved." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "And Mary, I wanted all of that too. I just didn't know how to give it to you." Mary felt tears threaten, but she blinked them back determinedly. "Wanting isn't enough, Damon. I needed action, and you couldn't give me that. I needed consistency, and you gave me broken promises." "You're absolutely right," he said without hesitation. "But Mary, I've spent every single day of the last 4 weeks learning how to be the man you needed me to be. I've been seeing a therapist 3 times a week. I've restructured my entire company so I don't have to work 18-hour days. I've been trying to understand why I was so terrified of letting you see how much I needed you." Despite herself, Mary felt a flicker of surprise. Damon Cross in therapy was almost as shocking as Damon Cross canceling important meetings. The man she'd married had seen emotional vulnerability as weakness, professional counseling as an admission of failure. "And what did you discover?" she asked quietly, genuinely curious despite her determination to protect her heart. His jaw tightened, and she watched him struggle with the vulnerability required for honest self-examination. "That I was terrified of being like my father," he said finally. "He loved my mother with a desperation that made him weak, needy, pathetic in her eyes. She left him when I was 12 because she couldn't stand being married to someone who had no backbone, no independence. I swore I'd never be that weak, that emotionally dependent on anyone." Mary's heart ached for the 12-year-old boy who'd watched his mother walk away because his father had loved her too much. But she also felt a familiar frustration at the pattern she recognized. "So you decided to be the complete opposite," she said softly. "So independent that you didn't need anyone. So focused on success that you forgot about the people who actually mattered." "Exactly." The word was barely above a whisper. "And I lost the most precious thing in my life because I was too proud and too terrified to admit that I needed you more than I needed my next breath." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of hurt and misunderstanding. Mary stared into her coffee, trying to process everything he'd said. This level of self-awareness, this willingness to examine his own failings and take responsibility for them, it was what she'd begged for during their marriage and never received. But was it real? Or was this just another version of the charm offensive he'd used during their courtship, when he'd convinced her that she was his top priority only to slowly disappear behind an impenetrable wall of work and ambition? "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, the words scraped raw from her throat. "I know," he said simply, and she was surprised by the acceptance in his voice rather than the anger or manipulation she might have expected. "I know I have to earn that trust back. I know it might take years, or it might be impossible. But Mary, I have to try. Because the alternative, living the rest of my life without you, isn't really living at all." Mary felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the walls she'd built to protect herself from exactly this kind of pain. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd seen through her careful composure to the passionate woman beneath, who'd made her feel like the most important person in his universe. But it was also the man who'd broken her heart so thoroughly that she'd barely survived it. "I need time," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. "I have all the time in the world," he said, standing slowly and pulling out his wallet to leave money for her coffee. "Mary, I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. I'll wait as long as it takes." As he turned to leave, she almost called out to him. Almost told him about the baby, about the life they'd created in their desperate final goodbye, about the future that was growing inside her whether she was ready for it or not. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by 4 weeks of carefully constructed independence and the bone-deep fear of being disappointed again. Instead, she watched him walk away, her hand moving to rest on her belly as she whispered to their unborn child, "What am I supposed to do now, little one? How do I know if people really can change?" The baby, as always, had no answers. But for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Mary felt the dangerous stirring of something that might have been hope. That evening, as storm clouds gathered ominously over the city, Mary found herself pacing her small apartment like a restless spirit. The conversation with Damon had left her emotionally raw and hopelessly confused, her carefully ordered world once again thrown into chaos by his unexpected presence in her life. She'd built something good over the past 4 weeks. A quiet life, perhaps, but one filled with purpose and possibility. Her consulting business was growing steadily, she had enough savings to support herself and the baby for the first year at least, and she'd finally started to feel like herself again rather than just the abandoned wife of Damon Cross. But seeing him today, hearing the raw honesty in his voice, had reminded her of everything she'd lost. Not just the passionate physical connection they'd shared, but the intellectual partnership that had challenged her to think bigger and dream larger. The way he'd made her feel like the most beautiful, brilliant woman in the world. At least, he had in the beginning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael, "Dinner tomorrow? Maria wants to cook for you and the baby." Mary smiled despite her emotional turmoil. Michael and his wife Maria had been trying to feed her constantly since the divorce, convinced that heartbreak could be cured with enough home-cooked meals and unconditional family love. She was typing back her acceptance when another text came through, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "I know you said you needed time, but I couldn't stop myself from sending this. It's something I should have written 3 years ago." Mary's heart began to race as she opened the attached image. It was a handwritten letter, photographed and sent to her phone. Even through the digital screen, she could see the slight tremor in Damon's usually precise handwriting, as if his hands had been shaking as he wrote. "My dearest Mary," it began, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. "I'm sitting in my office at 2 in the morning, staring out at the city lights and thinking about the night I first saw you. You were standing in front of that abstract painting at the Morrison Gallery, explaining to an elderly couple how the artist had used color and texture to convey the journey from despair to hope. You spoke with such passion, such insight, that I found myself eavesdropping just to hear your voice." Mary sank onto her couch, tears already blurring her vision. She remembered that night with perfect clarity, the silver-haired couple who'd been so interested in the symbolism of the piece, the way the gallery lights had created interesting shadows on the painting's surface. She'd had no idea Damon was listening, no idea that her words were weaving a spell around a man who would change her life forever. "I approached you afterward, ostensibly to ask about the artist's technique, but really because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving without speaking to you. When you smiled at me that radiant, genuine smile that lit up your entire face like sunrise, I felt something shift inside my chest. Something I'd never experienced before and haven't experienced since. Mary pressed her hand to her mouth, sobbing quietly as the memories flooded back. She could picture him that night, tall and devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored suit, his gray eyes intense and focused as he'd asked her about the painting's emotional impact. "I fell in love with you that night," the letter continued, "and I've been in love with you every single day since. Even when I was too proud to show it, even when I was hiding behind work and ambition and fear, even when I was signing papers that legally severed our bond, I loved you. I love you still, with a desperation that makes it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to exist in a world where you're not mine." The tears were flowing freely now, hot and cleansing as they tracked down her cheeks. This was the Damon she'd fallen in love with, the one who could be devastatingly romantic when he let his guard down, who could see straight into her soul and reflect back her own beauty. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he'd written. "I know I destroyed something beautiful and pure with my selfishness and cowardice. But Mary, if there's even the smallest chance that you could love me again, the real me, the man I'm learning to be rather than the emotionally unavailable stranger I became, then I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you're my priority. Not my work, not my ambition, not my fear of vulnerability. You." The letter was signed simply, D, with a small heart sketched beside it, the same symbol he used to draw on the steamed mirror after they showered together, the one that had made her laugh and feel cherished and completely, utterly loved. Mary set the phone aside and buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a mixture of grief and longing and dangerous, desperate hope. This was exactly what she'd wanted during their marriage, this level of emotional honesty, this willingness to be vulnerable and real with her. But it was also exactly what she was afraid of, the possibility that he could change, that they could have the love she'd always dreamed of, and that she might be strong enough to risk her heart again. Outside, thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against her windows. Mary looked up at the darkening sky and felt something shift inside her chest, the same seismic shift she'd felt the night they'd met, the night their baby was conceived, the night her entire world had changed. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to change again. Lightning illuminated the sky as Mary made her decision. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. It was time to tell Damon about their baby. It was time to see if the man who'd written that letter was real, or if she was setting herself up for the most devastating heartbreak of her life. But as she stepped into the storm, Mary realized that some risks were worth taking. Some love was worth fighting for. And some dreams, even broken ones, deserved a second chance. Chapter 3. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like ascending through the layers of her own heart, each floor representing another memory, another moment of their shared history that she tried so hard to forget. Mary stood there dripping rainwater onto the polished marble, her hair plastered to her head in dark tendrils, her emerald dress clinging to her body in a way that made her pregnancy unmistakably visible. She should have gone home first. Should have changed into something more appropriate, something that didn't scream, emotional breakdown in progress. Should have planned this moment instead of acting on pure, desperate impulse. But the letter had shattered the last of her carefully constructed defenses, and she couldn't wait another heartbeat to see if the man who'd written those words was the same one she'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, or if this was just another beautiful lie wrapped in romantic packaging. The elevator chimed softly as it reached his floor, and the doors slid open to reveal the familiar sight of Cross Industries' executive level. Everything was exactly as she remembered, glass and steel and expensive artwork designed to intimidate and impress. But tonight, with the storm raging outside the floor-to-ceiling windows and lightning illuminating the darkened offices, it felt different. More vulnerable somehow, as if the corporate fortress had been stripped of its power by the raw force of nature. Elena looked up from her desk, her eyes widening in shock and immediate concern as she took in Mary's bedraggled appearance. Even at this late hour, Elena was still there, loyal, dedicated, probably handling the crisis that Damon's recent behavior had undoubtedly created. "Mary. Dios mío, what are you doing here? You're soaked through to the bone." Elena was already reaching for the emergency blanket she kept in her desk drawer, the same soft throw she'd wrapped around Mary during the panic attack she'd had the day she'd signed the divorce papers. "Is he here?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling from cold and adrenaline and the magnitude of what she was about to do. Elena nodded toward Damon's closed office door, her expression shifting from concern to something that looked almost like hope. "He's been in there all evening. Hasn't eaten, hasn't taken any calls. He sent everyone home hours ago, but he's just been sitting in the dark, staring out at the storm." Mary's heart clenched at the image of him alone in that vast office, as isolated and tempest-tossed as she'd been in her apartment. "Can I?" "Of course." Elena's smile was gentle, encouraging. "Mary, he needs you. More than he's ever needed anyone or anything. More than he even knows how to admit." Mary approached his door on unsteady legs, each step feeling like walking across a tightrope suspended over an abyss. She knocked softly, then pushed the door open without waiting for permission, driven by a courage she didn't know she possessed. The office was shrouded in darkness except for the city light streaming through the windows and the dramatic flashes of lightning that turned the room into a black and white photograph of urban isolation. Damon sat in his chair, turned toward the storm, his silhouette motionless against the backdrop of the city below. He didn't turn when she entered, and for a terrifying moment she wondered if he'd even heard her over the thunder rolling across the sky like distant artillery. "I got your letter," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade through silk. He went absolutely still, not the stillness of relaxation, but the frozen tension of a man who just heard his deepest prayer answered in a voice he'd never expected to hear again. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning around, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. "Not in this storm. It's dangerous. I had to come." She moved closer, her wet shoes squeaking against the polished floor in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. "I had to tell you something that I should have told you weeks ago." Finally, slowly, he turned in his chair, and the expression on his face when he saw her nearly brought her to her knees. It was raw with hope and fear and love so intense it seemed to fill the entire room with electric charge more powerful than the lightning outside. His gray eyes took in her rain-soaked appearance, the way her dress clung to every curve of her body, and she saw the exact moment when understanding dawned like sunrise after the longest night of his life. "Oh my God," he breathed, his face going white as marble. "Oh my God, Mary. You're 16 weeks, she whispered, echoing the conversation he'd overheard in the doctor's office, the moment that had started this entire emotional avalanche. Right before the divorce was finalized. He stood slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever spell had brought her to him, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as he fought the obvious urge to reach for her, to touch her, to confirm that this moment was real and not another of the dreams that had been torturing him for weeks. "You're pregnant." His voice was hoarse with wonder and disbelief. "We're having a baby." "I'm having a baby," she corrected gently but firmly, the words carrying the weight of 4 weeks of solitary decision-making and careful independence. "You gave up the right to, when you signed those papers, when you chose your empire over our marriage." The words hit him like physical blows, and she watched him flinch as if she'd struck him. But he didn't argue, didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. Instead, he simply nodded, accepting the truth of her statement with the kind of mature accountability she'd never seen from him during their marriage. "You're absolutely right," he said quietly. "But Mary, please. Let me be part of this. Let me be the father our child deserves, even if I don't deserve the chance." "What if you can't?" The question exploded out of her, all the fear and uncertainty she'd been carrying for months finally spilling over like a dam bursting under pressure. "What if you try for a few weeks or months and then decide it's too hard, too demanding, too much of an interruption to your precious schedule? What if you choose work over us the same way you chose work over me? I won't. His voice was fierce with conviction, desperate with the need to convince her. Mary, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, I won't make that mistake again. How can you promise that? Tears were streaming down her face now, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair, her voice breaking with the weight of her terror. How can you know for sure when you've never had to choose between a crying baby and a board meeting? When you've never had to put a child's needs before a client's demands? Instead of answering with empty words, Damon moved to his desk with deliberate purpose and pulled out a thick folder she recognized, his contract with Cross Industries, the legal document that defined his role and responsibilities as CEO. What are you doing? Mary asked, confusion replacing anger as she watched him flip through pages with focused intensity. Showing you what I've already done, he said, turning the folder so she could see. These are the amendments I've been working on for the past 2 weeks, ever since I started therapy. I'm restructuring my entire position. Mary stared at the legal documents, her eyes scanning clauses about reduced work hours, mandatory family time, and delegation of crisis management. Damon, what is this? It's my new contract, he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. 30-hour work weeks maximum. No travel during weekends or holidays. No meetings before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. All crisis management delegated to my COO. And here, he pointed to a specific clause. Mandatory paternal leave, with the company required to function without my input for 3 months when our baby is born. Mary's breath caught as she read the terms. This wasn't just lip service or temporary accommodation, this was a complete restructuring of his professional life, legally binding and enforceable. The board hasn't seen this yet, he continued, pulling out his phone. I was waiting for the right moment, but... He looked directly into her eyes. There's no moment more right than this one. He began typing rapidly, and Mary watched as he composed an email to his entire board of directors. Effective Monday morning, he read aloud as he typed, the attached contract amendments will be implemented. These changes are non-negotiable and reflect my permanent new priorities. Cross Industries will adapt to accommodate my role as a present, involved father and husband, or they will need to find a new CEO. The choice is theirs, but my decision is final. Mary stared at him in amazement. You're not quitting? I'm evolving, he said firmly. Mary, I built this company, and I can run it on my terms. But those terms now include being the husband and father you both deserve. If the board doesn't like it, they can fire me, but I won't sacrifice my family for profit margins ever again. What if they say no? What if they refuse to accept these terms? Damon's smile was confident, the expression of a man who held all the cards. They won't. I'm the heart of this company, and they know it. My vision, my relationships, my innovations, they need me more than I need them. And now they'll learn to work around my family schedule. He looked at his phone screen, finger hovering over send. Mary, you and our baby aren't an interruption to my life, you are my life. The company will adapt because it has to. Are you sure about this? She whispered, hardly daring to hope. I've never been more certain of anything. He pressed send, then set the phone aside and moved toward her. Mary, I'm not choosing between my company and my family. I'm choosing to make my company serve my family instead of the other way around. Lightning crashed outside the windows, illuminating their faces in stark, dramatic relief as the implications of his decision settled between them. He'd found a way to have both his professional legacy and his personal happiness, but on completely different terms. What did you just do? Mary breathed, staring at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. I rewrote the rules, he said simply. I stopped letting the company own me and started making it work for us. Mary stared at this man who'd just revolutionized his entire approach to work and family, not with sacrifice, but with innovation and determination, and felt her heart crack open with possibility. I'm still terrified, she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her soul. So am I, he admitted, moving closer until he was close enough to touch her. I'm terrified I'll mess this up again. I'm terrified I don't know how to balance everything perfectly. But Mary, I'm more terrified of living without you. And now I don't have to choose. Thunder crashed overhead with explosive force, and the lights flickered ominously before going out completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the lightning that continued to strobe outside. In that dramatic chiaroscuro lighting, Mary saw their entire relationship, the passion and the pain, the love and the loss, the broken promises and the creative solutions. If we do this, she said slowly, her voice barely audible over the storm, if we try again, you have to prove these changes are real. I need to see that the company really will bend to accommodate our family, not the other way around. You will, he said with absolute conviction. Mary, I've spent weeks planning this restructure. I've identified every possible challenge and created solutions. I've built safeguards to protect our time together. This isn't a promise, it's a system. The certainty in his voice, the detailed planning he'd clearly put into this solution, broke down her final resistance like a dam collapsing under inevitable pressure. Okay, she whispered. Okay? His voice was hardly more than a breath, afraid to hope. Okay. She reached up to touch his face, feeling the warmth of skin she'd missed touching more than breathing. But Damon, if the old patterns creep back, if work starts taking priority again, it won't, he said with fierce promise, his hand covering hers against his cheek. Mary, I've learned something crucial, I can be successful and present. I can lead a company and be a devoted father. I just had to stop thinking it was an either-or choice. And then he was kissing her, soft and desperate and filled with 3 years of love and 4 weeks of heartbreak and the promise of a future where she wouldn't have to compete with his career because he'd made them partners instead of rivals. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm outside seemed to be moving away, leaving behind the clean, fresh scent of rain-washed air and new beginnings. So what happens now? Mary asked, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Now we go home, Damon said, his arms tightening around her. And tomorrow we start building the life we always should have had, together. Have you ever had to choose between what others expected and what your heart knew was right? Share your story below, these moments of courage inspire us all. The next morning brought an emergency board meeting, but this time Mary sat beside Damon in the conference room, her presence a visible reminder of his new priorities. The board members filed in looking concerned and confused, unsure what to expect from their suddenly unpredictable CEO. Gentlemen, Damon began, his hand briefly touching Mary's in a gesture of solidarity, you've all reviewed my contract amendments. I want to be absolutely clear, these terms are non-negotiable. Victor Cross sat at the far end of the table, his face stormy with disapproval. Son, this is professional suicide. No major corporation operates with a part-time CEO. I'm not part-time, Damon corrected firmly. I'm focused. I'm efficient. And I'm done pretending that being physically present for 60 hours a week makes me more effective than being mentally present for 30. Board member James Morrison leaned forward. Damon, we understand you want work-life balance, but the Singapore deal alone requires, the Singapore deal will be handled by my carefully trained team, Damon interrupted. I've spent 3 years building a company that can run efficiently without my constant micromanagement. It's time to trust that system. Mary watched the room, noting the mix of concern and curiosity on the faces around the table. These men had worked with Damon for years, but they'd never seen him this confident about delegation, this clear about boundaries. What about crisis management? Asked another board member. What if we need immediate decisions outside your availability window? Damon smiled, the expression of a man who'd thought of everything. Elena has been promoted to Executive Operations Manager. She has my full authority to make time-sensitive decisions within established parameters. For everything else, you wait until business hours." The room erupted in concerned murmurs, but Damon raised his hand for silence. "Gentlemen, let me be very clear about something," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I've been working 18-hour days for 3 years, and yes, we've been successful. But we've also been inefficient. We've made decisions in panic mode that cost us money. We've burned out good employees with unrealistic demands. We've created a culture of crisis instead of a culture of excellence." He stood, moving to the presentation screen with the confidence of a man presenting a winning strategy. "These contract amendments aren't about doing less work, they're about doing better work. About making thoughtful decisions instead of reactive ones. About building systems that don't require constant intervention." Mary felt a surge of pride as she watched him present his vision. This wasn't the workaholic she'd married, this was a leader who'd learned to work smarter, not just harder. "I'm giving you 2 choices," Damon continued. "Accept these terms and continue to benefit from my leadership and vision under a more sustainable model. Or refuse them and find yourselves a new CEO who can give you the same results." The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Mary held her breath, realizing that their entire future hinged on this moment. Victor Cross finally spoke, his voice tight with reluctant respect. "And if we accept these terms? If we restructure the entire company around your personal schedule?" "Then Cross Industries becomes a pioneer in sustainable leadership," Damon replied without hesitation. "We become the company that proves success doesn't require personal sacrifice. We attract the best talent because we offer the best work-life integration. And we continue to be profitable while setting a new standard for corporate responsibility." The vote was closer than Mary expected, but it passed. 8 votes in favor, 4 against, with the board agreeing to a 6-month trial period to evaluate the new structure. As they left the building that afternoon, Mary felt something she'd never experienced before, complete confidence in Damon's commitment to their family without requiring him to sacrifice his professional identity. "You did it," she said, wonder in her voice. "You actually found a way to have both." "We did it," he corrected, stopping to face her on the sidewalk. "Mary, none of this would matter without you. The company, the success, the innovation, it's all meaningless unless I have someone to share it with." 3 days later, Mary's brother Michael arrived for dinner and witnessed firsthand how the new system worked. When Damon's phone rang during their meal with what Elena described as an urgent client issue, he glanced at the clock, 6:47 p.m., and declined the call. "That could have been important," Michael said, testing. "It could have been," Damon agreed, cutting his steak with calm precision. "But it wasn't an emergency, and my family time is sacred. Elena will handle it, or it will wait until tomorrow morning." Michael watched this interaction with amazement, remembering the old Damon who would have answered every call, interrupted every family moment for business demands. Later that evening, as Mary showed Michael the nursery they'd been preparing, her brother pulled her aside. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "And I owe him one too. I didn't think he could really change." "Neither did I," Mary admitted. "But Michael, he didn't just change his behavior, he changed the entire system. He made it impossible for work to take over our lives again." 6 weeks later, they renewed their vows in a small courthouse ceremony, surrounded by family and friends who marveled at the transformation in both of them. But the real test came 4 months after that, when Mary went into labor during what should have been a crucial board meeting. Without hesitation, Damon handed control to his COO and rushed to the hospital, staying by Mary's side for the entire 36-hour labor. His phone remained off, his emails went unanswered, and Cross Industries continued to function perfectly without him. "Daddy," Mary whispered as Damon held their newborn daughter for the first time, "meet your daughter, Emma Grace Cross." Damon looked down at the tiny perfect face and felt his heart expand to accommodate more love than he'd known was possible. "Hello, beautiful," he whispered. "Daddy's here, and he's never going anywhere." True to his word, Damon took his full 3 months of paternal leave, during which Cross Industries not only survived but thrived under the distributed leadership structure he'd created. When he returned to work, it was to find that his innovative approach had attracted national attention, with other companies seeking to replicate his model. Turns out, he told Mary one evening as they watched 6-month-old Emma play on her blanket, being a present father makes me a better CEO, not a worse one. Who would have thought? I would have, Mary said, leaning into his arms. I always knew you were capable of extraordinary things when you put your mind to it. A year later, as Damon sat in his office working on a presentation about sustainable leadership practices, a speech he'd been invited to give at the Harvard Business School, Emma crawled around the floor while Mary reviewed gallery proposals at the conference table they'd added specifically for family time. His phone buzzed with what his old self would have classified as an emergency. Instead, he glanced at the clock for 30 p.m. and smiled. Elena, he called to his assistant, please handle the Morrison Industries situation. I'm done for the day. Already taken care of, Mr. Cross, Elena called back. Have a wonderful evening with your family. As Damon packed up his work and scooped his daughter into his arms, Mary looked up from her proposals with eyes full of love and admiration. No regrets, she asked, echoing the question she'd posed so many times during their journey back to each other. Only one, Damon said, kissing Emma's forehead before leaning down to kiss his wife. That it took me so long to realize I could have everything I wanted, I just had to be smart enough to structure it properly. We have everything, Mary agreed, her hand resting on her belly where baby number 2 was already growing. Success, love, family, and a future we built together. As they left the office together, the CEO, his wife, and their daughter, Damon reflected on how much had changed. He still ran a billion-dollar company, still made crucial decisions and led important meetings. But now he did it all within boundaries that protected what mattered most. He'd learned the most important lesson of his life: true success wasn't about choosing between family and career, it was about being innovative enough to excel at both. What moment in your own love story required the most courage? Have you ever had to choose love over fear? Share your heart with our community below. These stories of brave hearts finding their way to each other inspire us all. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart, subscribe for tomorrow's story of love conquering all odds, and comment below with your own experiences of finding creative solutions to life's challenges. In our Dear Love Diaries family, every story matters, every heart has value, and every ending can be a new beginning.